since just after childhood, I am going to say. Ann and I worked together on the Encyclopedia of Chicago. And we have remained friends and acquaintances ever since then. And Ann has this sort of amazing ability to pull out of narrative sort of a breathtaking essence of why they matter and why we should know them. And so I'm super excited to have her here on behalf of the History Center. She's become a little more involved over the course of the last year as we started to launch some new ideas and some new approaches. And this is a great program for us to have her be one of our public presenters. And I wanted to welcome everybody who's on board. You know, we're really happy to be able to put these presentations together. It is because of sponsors, donors, and members that we are able to do this. So if you are not currently a member, I would highly recommend joining. We've got a lot of great perks this year for membership, and you get early invitations to programs like these. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann, and I will mute myself.
Thank you. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to share a little bit tonight about Juliette Kinzie. And I'm going to start by making a little bit of a pitch about, if you haven't heard of Juliette Kinzie, why you should know about her. And then I'll talk a bit about her story. Juliette Kinzie is she's the first historian of Chicago. She is one of the few historians of the United States before the Civil War. She's a woman historian. Her teacher, Emma Willard, is also a woman who's a historian. And that's a really unusual thing. That's a really unusual thing. There just aren't all that many women that fit that bill. Juliette Kinzie is one of the 26 historians who are part of this volume that's put together of notable American women. So she's in this small group of women who are identified as historians who are really important in that way. So she tells key stories in early Chicago history. I want to make sure we highlight that fact and think about her in that way. So she's interesting in that alone. And in Women's History Month in March, it reminds us that women telling stories are a really important part of our of the work that we should be doing and thinking about. So she's also an interesting character because she comes to Chicago at a point in time when she first sees Chicago in 1831. There are only about 100 people living in Chicago. Chicago's an outpost in Indian country in 1830. And but that's going to change really quickly. We've got the Illinois and Michigan Canal. It's going to come in. Real estate speculation is going to just completely transform Chicago. It's going to make her family very wealthy. And then the railroads, industrialization, and Chicago's just going like gangbusters. It'll be 30,000 people by 1850. So before she's been there 20 years, it'll be 100,000 people living in Chicago by 1860 and 300,000 plus when she dies in 1870. So her story in Chicago is 1831, 32, through her death in 1870. And she sees a lot of Chicago. And it's a particularly interesting slice of Chicago. It's a first try at a civic culture based on Eastern ideals. So that's an important part of this. She's part of that early fabric there. But it's also a world before the Chicago fire. And when I first started doing urban history many moons ago, the prevailing wisdom was that there wasn't much to find on Chicago before the 1871 fire. And of course, many other scholars have found that that's not really the case. But Juliette Kinzie left a cache of letters that allowed me to tell this story in an interesting way. And her letters are found in collections at, well, I read most of them on microfilm at the Chicago History Museum, but they came from archives at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah and from the University of North Carolina's special collections, their Southern Family Collection. There's a Southern connection here that I think is another interesting thing. Her granddaughter is Juliette Gordon Low, who was the founder of the Girl Scouts in 1912. And Juliette Gordon Low, because of that, Juliette's letters it's one of the reasons why Juliette's letters get saved. Her daughter is a prominent woman in Savannah, Georgia, and that's the mother of Juliette Gordon Low. And so these letters get saved. So it's unusual that she had the time and the interest and the skill to write the letters, but it's even more unusual that they got saved. So it's really just this wonderful cache of letters. Many of them are back and forth between Juliette and her daughter. So they span a number of years, but Juliette wrote letters from a very early age. So let me start and talk a little bit about we'll talk about her writings, we'll talk about her experiences in the West. So Juliette is born in 1806 in Middletown, Connecticut. So she's not a Westerner, she's an Easterner. Middletown, Connecticut in 1806 was the biggest city in Connecticut. And her grandfathers had both been sea captains who were in the Caribbean trade. They dabble in all kinds of stuff. She's got another part of her family, the Wolcotts, were very prominent politicians in Connecticut in the late 18th and into the 19th century. So her experience growing up is in this urban place. I mean, today you go to Middletown and it's not all that bigger than it was then, but it was a substantial town / urban place when she's born in 1806, and she's born into a very prominent family in town. And her early years then, she spends a lot of time learning a great deal in her grandfather's study. Her mother is well-read, well-educated, and trains and teaches all of her youngsters. Juliette's she really likes to read and to write, and she starts to get to practice out her writing when her uncle Wolcott, who is her mother's brother, takes up the position as Indian agent at Chicago. So now we've got the Chicago connection. She's out here and she's 14, and her uncle winds up in Chicago. It's after the second Fort Dearborn is built. He's becomes the Indian agent, and it's a political position. So it's because these Wolcott connections in Connecticut helped to get him this appointment. But he goes out and he's the Indian agent at Chicago. He runs into a family named the Kinseys, who are big deal in town in Chicago. So we've got the Kinsey connection going from early on, and her uncle is going to love Chicago, is going to marry into the Kinsey family. So we've got this outpost of her family out in Chicago, and she starts to write to her uncle. And her uncle writes back these letters about how wonderful Chicago is and how interesting place it is. And she is just, there's no question that Juliette just falls in love with the idea of the West and the idea of being in Chicago. And her father, back in Middletown, goes bankrupt in the Panic of 1819. He's in jail, debtor's prison, right? And lots of people are hounding their family. They're going to leave town. They're going to live in a couple of places up in New York and along the Hudson Valley in the succeeding years. So Juliette is looking for an escape. I have to say, when we think about her experience, her uncle really holds out this something different, but still her family out in Chicago. And so I think she's really becomes very entranced with them, and she's writing letters. So these letters back and forth. And the photograph. So I loved finding these houses. So I'm going to be able to talk about 3 houses that I know Juliette was in. I'm sure many of you have the same kind of a feeling. You want to get into the house or into the space that the historical figure that you're studying was in. And I'm going to show you where Juliette Kinzie's house in Chicago was, but it's gone. But these houses where I was able to pin together. This one, I got, very early in the morning, drove out to Middletown from Boston in 2013. And it's a mental health facility, it's outpatient, but I'm circling the building and I'm taking photographs and I'm going close up and looking in windows. And finally somebody comes out and it's like, what are you doing? You know, and when I explained it all, they actually let me come in. So I got to, I'm big on the banisters and being able to touch the banisters, that my historical figures. So I love going to Springfield to put my hand on Abraham Lincoln's banister in Springfield. At any rate, the house in Middletown, she's going to be influenced then by her uncle. Her uncle travels in 1820 with Governor Cass. So he's Lewis Cass, the Michigan Territory, is out doing this travel up to the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And and her uncle goes with this group. And alongside this, in this group too, is a man by the name of Henry Schoolcraft. And Henry Schoolcraft's job was to write up what they saw, draw, make maps. And he publishes this book in 1821, so the year after they make this trip out west, and they come through Middletown. So Juliette gets to see her uncle and Henry Schoolcraft. This book is just published. If you don't know this book, this is a wonderful travelogue of looking at this region in Chicago in 1820, and it's absolutely a model. You can see that it's a model, and Juliette and her uncle go back and forth. Her uncle's like, you draw better than he does. You could do this, you know? And so kind of sets her up for thinking about, I can go west. I can be this kind of a scholar, of an ethnographer, of a historian of this era. She gets a chance to go to school. Not all that many young women are going to get a chance to go to school beyond, and this is beyond a grammar school. She goes to Emma Willard's Academy, which is going to be ultimately in Troy, New York. And it really is, today it ends at high school, but it was very much an institution of higher education for women. And it was one of the very few in the United States in the 1820s. She's only there for a little over a year, but she takes coursework from Emma Willard. And Emma Willard's also a really important influence for thinking about, why does she do this writing and what she's going to be doing. Emma Willard teaches the history of the United States in a time when people weren't really studying US history. So Emma Willard does that. She also is very focused on making maps, on cartography, and the value of maps in education. And I think we can really see Schoolcraft and Willard's hand, as well as Alexander Hamilton, do that all the time. Alexander Wolcott, her uncle's influence on her. So all three of those give us a sense of why she got interested in the West. So 1830 comes along, August of 1830, she gets married to her uncle's brother-in-law, because her uncle is married a daughter of in the Kinsey family, and he's still at Chicago 13 years after he first arrived. And John Kinsey, a junior John Kinsey, has been growing up the whole time that her uncle, that Alexander Wolcott's been in Chicago. And John Kinsey, then, our guy that's going to marry Juliette, has been apprenticed to the American Fur Company. So he's been headquartered up at Mackinac Island for half dozen years. A very long time that he was gone. So he really was in and out. He wasn't there all that much when the family was, when Wolcott was there, except for family visits. At this point in 1830, he's working for the Indian Department of the U.S. Army. So he is a sub-agent for Indian Affairs to the Ho-Chunk. So he's headquartered at Portage. And he makes these trips periodically to the East Coast. He's bringing Native Americans. After the Red Bird Rebellion, he brings Native Americans to meet with Thomas Jefferson. And this is John Quincy Adams. I'm thinking of another episode that was much earlier. So what he does here, at any rate, so he runs into Juliette at some point or another. They obviously know each other. They're family members in this in-laws relationship. And they mustn't have met more than, a half dozen times, but they decide to get married. Juliette clearly loves being in the West, so she marries John Kinsey. They do have this long, apparently very loving marriage and family life. The pet names in this family are Legion, and so it's not I don't think it was an arranged marriage. At any rate, we'll leave it at that. She goes west for the first time then in 1830, and she starts writing about it, and she starts doing drawings because this is where she's wanted to be for more than a decade. And she gets to Detroit, and she's going to draw Detroit. She's going to get on a ship and go from Lake Huron across to Green Bay. She doesn't get to Chicago in 1830 when she's married. Instead, they land in Green Bay, and they're going to head over to Portage. And in Portage, John and Juliette are going to build this. When they get to Portage, there's no agency house, so they're going to have to build an agency house. So this is the second house that you can go see. This is the DAR in Wisconsin has done the restoration of this house at Portage, and it's the U.S. agency house. But the Kinseys built it and furnished it with many of the things that Juliette brought with her from the East. She was just laden down with china and linen and a piano and artwork. It was all, she was out to bring East Coast culture out into this, what she thought of as a wilderness, but Indian country. So she's working as she's writing, as she's going and having these experiences, she's writing things down, she's working on these stories. Ultimately, she will publish this decades later as Wabun, which is the early day in Ho-Chunk. So she publishes this book called Wabun, again, not until 1856, but the book then includes descriptions of her experiences in Wisconsin, and getting to Wisconsin and everyday life. She's again, an ethnographer of the Ho-Chunk. She identifies specific Ho-Chunk men and women she has relationships with that she describes. It's a really rich, wonderful resource if you haven't seen it. This book remains in print down to the present. There's been at least 12 editions of Wabun, and a number then of the chapters are her own experiences in Wisconsin. In 1831, she, and this is actually, you get a sense of, this is the black and white image that's on the cover of my book, that you get a sense of, this is how I thought about that image. But it's again, a wonderful GPA Healy oil. So Juliette finally gets to Chicago in the spring of 1831. Her husband and she make the trip in March of 1831. It's this time of the year. The reason they make the decision to come in March is because they feel it's after you're going to catch really bad weather. And of course, they hit really bad weather. It's going to snow because it's March, right? And it's Wisconsin and Illinois. But they're hoping that it'll be frozen enough that they can make this trip on horseback without too much difficulty. And it's a tough trip, but it's a fascinating trip. And she tells us all about the stops she makes along on the Rock River, and then making her way eastward from the Rock River across the Fox River, Des Plaines, and then into Chicago, and they get lost. I mean, it's also really interesting to get a sense of, well, how did you get from Portage to Chicago when there really were no roads? There were certainly paths and ways that people took, but people got lost. I mean, there's just no question about it. John Kinsey knew about as much as any American would know in this region. Definitely not as much as a Potawatomi in this region would know, but he got himself lost. So it was a little bit of a fraught trip. It was a fraught trip as well, because by the time Juliette and John get here in the spring of 1831, she's never met her in-laws, and she really wanted to see her uncle. Unfortunately, her uncle has died in the meantime, from when she got married in August of 1830 and spring of 1831. Some epidemic runs through the small settlement at Chicago, and both her uncle and his two children die, leaving his wife widowed, again, Juliette's sister-in-law, also her, yeah, you got it. It's a good and complicated little relationship. But at any rate, she spends for the first time in Chicago, and she talks about what a sad time it was. And of course, it's sad because her uncle and these two children have died. But it's also sad because the family is packing up and they're going to have to leave Chicago. And she gets her mother-in-law talking. So Eleanor Kinsey tells all kinds of tales about her experiences. She's come to Chicago in 1803. So this is 30 years of experiences at Chicago, including the Battle of Fort Dearborn in 1812. And Juliette, she's listening with rapt attention, and she writes this up. It's going to take a few years before it gets published, but this will be the middle chapters of Wabun. Some central chapters are about the history of Chicago. So this is really where the first history of Chicago is a part of this book. It's also where Juliette is going to publish, again, these drawings, like Schoolcraft, like Emma Willard, who encouraged her students. I don't know specifically they encouraged her, but that she encouraged her students to use not audiovisual, but visuals, right? Drawings and maps to teach, to explain, to show people places that they hadn't been. Juliette draws this image. I used this image for years. This is what she called the Kinsey Mansion. It's actually the house that Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable built around 1790 on the north branch of the Chicago River, across from, well, Fort Dearborn will be built after Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable leaves town. But Juliette draws this, and ever since I've been doing Chicago history, and it's probably been, I've been interested in Chicago history since Mayer and Wade, so since 1968, 69, that Chicago history really intrigued me. This image, I just never thought twice about the fact that a woman did this. That this image, this first picture that we really carry around in our head of Chicago is done by Juliette. It's going to be reprinted all over the place. I first saw it not in Wabun, but in A.T. Andreas. She's also going to get involved in maps. And this map of the Battle of Fort Dearborn, again, is based on the stories that her mother-in-law tells her. It's published first in 1844, and then it's reprinted in the 1856 Wabun. She put this map together. Whether or not she had help finally drawing it in the map that goes into the book, this is her hand. She's done the work of putting the information together that's going to go into this map. So she's got a lot of talent. She's a really important person. And again, this is a map that I've used over and over again. We used it in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, and I didn't think twice about who had done this map and where it had come from. So she's an interesting character in that way. Okay, so we're back to Juliette then helps her mother-in-law pack up, and they go back up to Portage, and they're kind of out of Chicago. This is in 1831. If you know much, Chicago, early Chicago history, we're coming on a big event, and that is the 1832 Black Hawk War, which is going to affect this region. So she and her in-laws have gone back up to Portage. She's actually pregnant with her first child, but they're at Portage, and this war breaks out. The Sauk, for lots of good reasons, attack the U.S., and they're going to have a number of battles, largely in southern Wisconsin, so not nearby. But her husband, John Kinsey, will be out and very much a part of trying to keep the Ho-Chunk from joining in this fight. Juliette is left back at home through this time period with her in-laws, sister-in-law. And this piano, it's wonderful. This is not her piano, but it is the same model piano that Juliette brought from New York. So it comes out to Portage, and it's on display at the Portage House down right now. So you can go see it. Okay, so end of the Black Hawk War brings an end to Indian country in this region. There's going to be a big treaty in 1833. And the Native Americans living in this region are going to have to leave. And it's going to take a few years, but the Potawatomi are going to wind up west of the Mississippi River in their, it really is a trail of tears that the Potawatomi are embarked on. And the Kinseys make a choice. They could have gone west. And in fact, John Kinsey has a brother who goes west with the Potawatomi or move with the Ho-Chunk. But John and Juliette make a very different decision. And it's interesting for someone who was so enamored with the West, so much, so, from all of her young years. And then she comes out west in 1830. And here in 1833, she's choosing that to not go further west, to not stay in Indian country, but to be a part of this new enterprise at Chicago that's going to be this Eastern speculative venture. So she and John really turn their backs on Indian country, although she's going to continue to write and to present herself as someone who knows a great deal more than everybody else. So the Kinseys are going to make a fortune in real estate. And that's, deeply troubling when you stop to think about, she's written all these very knowledgeable, empathetic often descriptions of Indian women and the work that they're doing up near Portage. And yet she and her husband make a choice here that they're going to move to Chicago, take land that had been Potawatomi land, make it into real estate, and make fortunes. So the money that this family makes rests on real estate. It's also going to rest on money that they get out of the Treaty of 1833. So it's Indian settlements. So they've got a real pot of money, and the Kinseys then will be one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Chicago for a period of time. They're going to start losing money the minute the panic of 1837 sets in, and they don't make good decisions during the Depression that ensues. But right at the outset, they make a lot of money. So Juliette, they have trappings of being, again, of wealth in this community. And they have this portrait painted. This is a portrait painter from Peoria, Benjamin Wilkins, who comes up and paints Juliette. And again, this is the same woman who's on the cover of the book. I love being able to, in fact, I made a pitch that younger Juliette should be on the cover of the book, but nobody recognizes her. So it didn't resonate, but she's here with her daughter, Nellie, who is just a couple of years old in 1836. And this is the pair that so many of the letters are going to be back and forth with. So Nellie then and Juliette are going to move into this house. So this house is not standing. The house is at, I always need to look it up because I can't keep it in my head, Illinois and Wabash. I can tell you it was called Michigan and Cass, but I always screw up so Michigan, where the heck is that? It's just north of Trump Tower. So you get a sense of where this is in the city today. In fact, it's one of the double-decker streets, and it's been an empty lot for a period of time now. But this house then was this is probably the biggest house in town. I think I can make that argument. Bigger than the Widow Clark house that was built around the same time, that still stands, that we celebrate. And that's a frame house. This is a brick house, frame town. They have to pay to have a brickyard put in, and they do because they want this brick house. And they're going to live in this house, John and Juliette and an extended family. They're going to live here from 1836 until just a few years before Juliette's death, but all the way through. John will die in 1865, and she's going to be in debt and is going to have to leave the house. But this house then is the center of their world. You can see in the background the other thing that's going to anchor the world that she's going to be creating, and that's an Episcopal church. So one of the things that she's doing when she's in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, is she's building institutions at Chicago. And it's really a very interesting thing that she's able to do. So St. James Episcopal, the cathedral is now the parish church that she helped found. But this was initially right across the street from their house, not by coincidence. The Kinseys provided the lots, they provided the land on which this church is built, and they provided the bricks. I mean, they did a lot of the work for this church. So they're basically going to create a neighborhood, and this is a map of the near north side that she's that she and her husband are really starting to create with the church. There's going to be schools, a market, so a regulated market, the lake house, a big hotel that they're going to help to sponsor. So you get a sense of all of this in a tight circle around this family house that's set in a beautiful set of gardens. John Kinsey writes quite a bit for the gardening, for the Prairie Farmer. So he's famous for peaches and other fruits that he grows in his backyard. So by 1857, the neighborhood they live in has really been built up. So the lower right-hand circle is their house. You can see it. This is 1857, the Palmatory map. So it's just this amazing map. I'll show you the full on one in just a second here. St. James is just across the street. The lake house is just down the street, and it's this big kind of a horseshoe, but it's a three-part building with it open to the east, because we are to the bottom here is to the east. We've got the main stem of the Chicago River here just to the left-hand side. So they're, again, just on the near north side. The lake house by 1856 was not a hotel anymore. It was a hospital. Mercy Hospital has its first incarnation in this building. And then there's a variety of other hospitals that are going to roll through it. You see just south of, just east of this, just on the bottom of this map would have been McKinley, McCormick's, Reaper Works. You've got steamships and sailing ships in the river itself. The grain elevators, Bill Cronin's work on this on the 1850s. These grain elevators are enormous hulking buildings. This is what, a block and a half from their house, which was once out, kind of idyllic with set around this. The first train station, so the Galena and Chicago train station is up at the top left-hand side there, the red brick. So they are close proximity. Their neighbors, the other folks that had been wealthy, many of them have made even more money, and they're moving further north. Near to where St. James Cathedral is today. So just moving up on the near north side. The Kinseys stay put for a whole variety of reasons, but they are really helping to craft a set of institutions. So again, their church, schools, orphanages, hospitals. Cholera comes through Chicago late 1840s into the 1850s, and John and Juliette helped to found a hospital, an orphanage, and respond again to the cholera epidemic in that way. This is the big panorama. So you get a sense of Juliette is here while Chicago is growing in this dramatic and amazing fashion. And she's here in 1831, and she can identify the 8 or 9 houses that she saw as being the central part of the Chicago settlement when she's there in 1831. And you couldn't possibly do that here by 1857 in the Palmatory map. She's also looking at her legacy. So in 1856 is when she publishes Wabun, so the book about her experiences and the history of the Kinsey family. She's laying claim to the Kinsey story that they are the founders of Chicago. Those of you that have been following this monuments debate in Chicago know that a number of the monuments that are on the discussion, out for discussion, are tied up actually with Juliette's writing of that history. Some of them deservedly need to be perhaps removed or refigured. Some of them I would argue with that they have less to, that they are more accurate and more interesting than perhaps other folks might think of. But she has paintings done. They don't have a ton of money. G.P.A. Healy is one of the most famous portrait painters in Europe and America at this point. He's going to paint most of the presidents in the mid-19th century, does a number of Abraham Lincoln, one of my very favorite US grants. A lot of them are at the Newberry, a number of them are at the National Portrait Gallery. They have their portraits done, both Juliette and John, and then their daughter, Nellie, has they have her portrait done in a full length, right? So this is the first time I'd seen this, and it's actually a copy of the original, which is still in the Gordon/Kinsey family somewhere, as I understand it, in Savannah. So this is down at the Juliette Gordon Low birthplace. So the reason that we've got this wonderful, this is the fourth house that I tie to Juliette, and this is down in Savannah. And we know she's here because her daughter marries this Southerner, William Gordon, in December of 1857 and moves to Savannah. He's a cotton trader and a slaveholder, and it's a very complicated set of years. They have a very complicated courtship. Juliette's daughter Nellie and her intended, and then her husband, because they have widely varying viewpoints on slavery, on region, probably most of all religion, from their standpoint. But they settle it all, and Nellie moves to Savannah, where Juliette then has to visit to see her grandchildren. Two daughters are born before the Civil War, but Juliette and Nellie go back and forth probably every couple of days. They're writing letters to each other for all of these years. And as you can imagine, during the Civil War itself, we've got, there are huge questions about how to get mail from Chicago to Savannah. And Juliette tries an amazing number of ways. John at one point writes, I think she's going to send letters via China next, right? I mean, he's just making light of the fact that she sent letters through Canada, through London, through Cuba, through certainly through Confederate lines. She pays people to carry things. She sends letters to prisoners of war. So Union soldiers held as prisoners of war in Confederate prisons, with the idea that she sends them to them, they get the letters, they talk to their captors who agree to put the letters in the Confederate mail. And she gets a lot of these letters to her daughter, and they go back and forth. She petitions Abraham Lincoln, not once, but twice, to send trunks, that she gets permission to send trunks to her daughter, mostly to her grandchildren. They need shoes, they need, art supplies. I want to send this all. She's just this, they're all good, loyal Americans. They're not Confederates. And, it's very fraught because her son-in-law is a Confederate officer by the end of the war. He originally joined the Georgia Hussars. And Juliette has three sons. All three sons who've lived to adulthood are going to be a part of the war. They're going to all serve in the US Army, as does her husband, who is going to be a paymaster. Her oldest son dies in the war. He's killed in a steamboat explosion near Memphis on the Mississippi River. And the two younger sons are both taken prisoner of war near the end of the war itself. They're both fairly young. One of them's only 17 years old when he enlists. So it's a good, complicated, and interesting story. Nellie and Juliette wrestle with all kinds of issues of the day. So I get to play with that in the text. They send photographs because they've got photographs. She loves new technology like this, and she supports the photographers in Chicago, as well as that. And again, her letter to Abraham Lincoln asking for the trunk to go through. My daughter Nellie, who unhappily for her and for us is down in Dixie. And she goes on from there. She knows Abraham Lincoln, as they've run into each other in, they're both they're Whig families. So she knows them all in there. After the war is over, now Juliette's husband, John, dies. 6 weeks after Lincoln is assassinated, he has a massive heart attack and dies on his way to reuniting with his daughter. Juliette's going to live the last 5 years of her life as a widow, and she's going to have trouble coming and going. There's a lot of debts. Her husband carried a lot of debt, and as a widow, she was in probate court for really years. And she found herself really railing against the restrictions that were placed on her as a widow. But then she also tried to use the dower to recoup some of the money that she felt had been taken unfairly by many Chicago businessmen, including William Ogden. So she made herself something of a persona non grata by the end of her years, but fought till the end. And she does set up, I think, a very interesting counter to thinking about people like Mary Todd Lincoln as simply mad, and perhaps suggesting that being a widow, and particularly a widow, a widow of Mary Todd and Juliette's age in the years after the American Civil War, were very tough years in terms of having any kind of autonomy in this world. She's buried then in Graceland Cemetery, and she dies in Long Island, and her body is brought back to Chicago, and she's buried then in Graceland in a family plot that's just west of the Dexter family grave, which is it's big black, wonderful sculpture. But they have the family plot there. And I think fittingly, there's a book on her tombstone that her daughter puts up after the Gordon family is doing better in the 1880s. And Juliette, yeah, so her book stays in press down to the present. And I'll stop there. Happy to take questions or comments that you might have.
All right, well, you can either type into the chat or you can unmute if you would like to take questions. And if you want to unshare, then we can get sort of everybody up on
Got it. Thank you. Good idea. Thank you.
All right. So, fascinating. And given that both you and I worked on that Encyclopedia of Chicago, there is a lot in there I did not know. Like, it's riveting to think about that. So was the house that she owned on Cass, was that lost in the fire in 1871?
Yeah, so it burns in the fire. The Lake House and the Kinsey house burn in the fire, but they don't own, by that point, they've had to give that up. So they own some property there, but not the house.
Okay. All right, so Craig says, tell the death story, which does not mean something to me, but I'm assuming it means something to you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. Okay, so Juliette, she packs up everything in the summer of 1870, and she makes a settlement. Actually, William Ogden comes through with some money, so she's actually got a little money. Oh my God, she fights with William Ogden, but she goes east to Long Island to spend a couple of months with her daughter. I think there are 3 children, and her daughter is very pregnant. So she's due in the middle of September, and this is the first 10 days of September that they're there and enjoying being at the beach. She's not very far from where she was born, right? Because the Connecticut River, where this is at Emma, I'm going to forget. I'm not going to be able to pronounce the town on Long Island, but anyway, they're on Long Island, and she gets a prescription, a medicine from a pharmacist that she thinks is quinine, and it's actually morphine. Oh, no. And she takes an overdose and dies overnight. And her daughter tastes this and has a terrible reaction. She's very close to giving birth, and I mean, morphine is used in, so there's the story's a little, to my mind, is a little murky about all the pieces here, but she winds up overdosing and dying on Long Island, and her daughter can't take her back because her daughter is there with 3 kids. I mean, they're there with 3 kids, another on the way. There's a couple of servants, there's a cousin, they're all there in this group that was enjoying themselves here at the end of the summer. And so it's an Irish servant who Juliette doesn't really get along with. And she is she has terrible things to say about Irish servants, Irish neighbors. I mean, she really has nothing nice to say, but this Irish woman accompanies the body back to Chicago. And I don't know that was what the question was about, but it's one of those, you're just left with piecing that all together. Some of those, the letters that were most interesting on that were down in North Carolina at Chapel Hill, because Nellie kept all of the correspondence, and she's writing to her husband. So it's really her husband and she back and forth about what's happened here. And that's how I pieced this story together, was in that way. But yeah, it's just, so it's very sudden, and she's in the middle of doing proofs on a book. She's written a couple novels after the Civil War, and Nellie will eventually get them published.
So how long did researching this and getting it published take for you?
Oh, yeah. So I got interested in this, and I probably didn't say this. I wrote a book that was published in 2012 on the Battle of Fort Dearborn. So marking what many of you probably think of as the Fort Dearborn Massacre, but you're not going to call it the Fort Dearborn Massacre. It's the Battle of Fort Dearborn, because just don't want to call it a massacre for a whole variety of reasons. Not that lots of people didn't die, but you don't want to do that. So when I did that, I used Juliette Kinzie, right? I used Wa Bun. I used her descriptions of what and her mother-in-law's descriptions of what took place. And she's been poo-pooed. I mean, the encyclopedia talks about, there are 2 entries that talk about Juliette. One of them describes her as perhaps the first novelist of Chicago. That is, I mean, just a complete slam, not a historian. It's all a fiction. And it's like, it wasn't a fiction. What I read, I could corroborate, right? You know, and so it wasn't like I was using her alone, but I knew that she was writing stories that, yeah, they'd been family stories, but they were backed up in large measure by what took place. Did she paint her in-laws as the best, the first, whatever? Oh, absolutely. But once you're over that, there's all kinds of interesting things. At any rate, so I got done with that, and I'm like, I really would like to know more about her, because Milo Quaife, who many of you may know, wrote a lot of history in the early part of the 20th century on Chicago and the Midwest. He was at the Detroit Public Library for many years, and he really, he trashed, I think is probably not a bad way to describe Juliette and Wa Bun, and said that it was just not, and this is where we still see it in the encyclopedia, is that it got repeated over and over again. And I really wanted to rehabilitate her a little bit. And so there was a project that went along with the one that Carol and I worked on, the Encyclopedia of Chicago, that was going on in parallel, that I had nothing to do with, but I'm sheepish about that now. The Women Building Chicago. So the project on women's history in Chicago was taking place at the same time. And the woman who wrote the entry on Juliette Kinzie and I sat down. It's Rima Lunan Schultz. And Rima, I started talking to her a little bit about this. She's like, you have to go read these letters. And so, of course, once you start reading these letters, you know, they're from a mother to her daughter who's far away. At that point, my own daughter was living in Boston, and it was just kind of like, oh, this is really quite interesting, you know. And she talked about being past the middle of your life, and it was just, I was very intrigued by it. And then it started thinking about, this story really does change the way I think about Chicago. So that was interesting too. I mean, Bessie Louise Pierce describes this as a man's country, you know, a man's city in her history, right? Bessie Louise Pierce, who's a really, I mean, think about the Juliette Kinzie and Bessie Louise Pierce, two of the really big names, I think, in people that have written about Chicago, and they're both women. And we don't really think about that enough and play with that, I think, enough. And so, yeah, at any rate, that was, I think I got lost there, Carol, with what you were asking.
No, that was because one of my questions along those lines was, how many of the letters did you have to just go dig up and find? And how, like, knowing that they were down at the house in
collection, right?
Right. Like, how hard was it to sort of gather all of these disparate pieces across all of these institutions?
Yeah, they were in most of them are in those two, were down in either in Chapel Hill or in Savannah. There's some letters up in Madison, so there was some up in at the library up there. There was some at the History Museum. What's interesting is that Carolyn McIlvaine, who was the secretary at the Chicago History Museum, did a lot of collecting of these materials. So there's copies of things. And then Paul Engel, who was the librarian at the Chicago Historical Society in the 40s, 50s, and I think into the 60s, he got this microfilm and brought it to Chicago. So yeah, and working with microfilm, it's more fun, obviously, to be with the letters. Yeah, it was a big dash. So it was a kind of work that I've never done because I've usually done research in Chicago. So I never felt under tremendous pressure of grabbing everything you can and leaving. So I learned a lot about taking digital images and stuff like that. So it was fun in that way. And so it took me years after I did these trips to actually read the letters and go through and figure out what was going on. Yeah.
It is nice that she has very nice handwriting. I will say that.
Yes, she has beautiful handwriting. She really does. And I'm very grateful.
All right, audience, do you have any questions? I don't want to monopolize the questions. Any comments, thoughts? All right, Liz, you want to unmute?
There. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Can.
And this was fabulous, and it really means a lot to me because I'm from Portage.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah, and I grew up going to the old Indian Agency House and the Garrison School and so on across the street. 2 years ago, we had a family reunion, so several of us went to the old Indian Agency House after, gosh, a 50-year hiatus or something.
Oh my gosh.
And she's quite the heroine there, and the picture that they paint of her is just the most caring, magnanimous person that there is, with the Indians.
Yeah.
Not lording over them, making sure that they're taken care of. My favorite is the story of how that piano got to Portage.
Go ahead.
Well, just that back then, and you've been there recently, so you've seen the mighty Fox River, which is about 15 wide.
Right.
But it used to be massive, and there used to be the large boats on it that would travel down, and you could go from the St. Lawrence Seaway and to the Gulf of Mexico and only have to get out of your boat once, and that was in Portage. And because there was a mile portage to get from the Fox River to the Wisconsin River.
Right.
But she had all of these trunks and everything, and they had to, get out and walk in places and so on. It's fascinating. But
yeah,
thank you. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. She brought an amazing amount of stuff with her. It just kind of and kept, I think, a lot of it. So I could track the piano all the way into right after the Civil War. I know she moved it when she left the house, and then I lost it. I mean, I don't know what happened in the last 18 months of her life, because she kind of goes, I mean, it's a really sad moment. She goes from being someone who's been the center of this house. Anybody coming in the family would just come and stay at their house. She raised cousins, nieces, nephews. Everyone was a part of this household. And but she had this house that really anchored all of that. And to have to give this house up, I think was, well, I know because I've read, the letters are just almost unbearable for her, that she can't do that she has to stay with other people, where everyone had always stayed with her. So, I mean, I agree. Her descriptions of the Ho-Chunk women are amazing. So I couldn't agree more with you about that. I mean, one of the things about the up in Portage that I wrestle with is that those U.S. Army guys and families brought enslaved people with them, right? So there were enslaved servants, really. They served the U.S. Army officers and their families, and so they were not owned by the U.S. Army, but owned by the families. So one of the guys, the guy who was there was Captain Twigg, I think Twigg, and he lands out in Texas for the Confederacy. So he's going to land during the Civil War, which is also interesting. But he basically that they have an enslaved woman in Juliette and John's household through a chunk of this. So and then she also has these little bound girls. And it's like, what's a little bound girl? And it turns out that it's the mixed race children of the French and the Indian families would, and so basically that was where where her servants came from initially. The story of her relationship with her servants is one that, there are moments when she says the most awful things. So on the one hand, you are absolutely right. She's such a wonderful, her attitude towards the Ho-Chunk men and women, the Potawatomi men and women that she meets is so modern in many ways, right? It's person to person, it's treating people as individuals. Then she turns around and she treats servants in her household in ways that you're just, it defies my imagination. And it's when I realized that I am not her, she is not me. She is not living in 2015, 16, 17. I have to understand what her vision is. And I think then it started to dawn on me that she really saw, now Native Americans were just out of the American picture, right? They were the other. And she had a great deal of, and again, but not in a disdainful way, but just radically different. They had radically different lives than she did. But people who were in her household, there was this hierarchy. She believed in the patriarchy. She was not all that. I mean, she was not pro-slavery, but she wasn't really that. It didn't really bother her that there were people that had no rights in a household.
She was okay with the cast.
She was okay. Yeah, she was completely okay with it. And then she saw herself as a part of that. So she tells her daughter, when her daughter's having trouble early on in her marriage, she says, I can't do anything for you unless he's like beating you or not taking care of you, in which case we'll come and get you. But unless that's happening, you belong to him. And it was a line, I mean, when I read that and I realized she means it. She's like, you do what he says. This is your God, you made this decision. She's not enslaved. It's not the same thing, but she's still, and so I've wrestled with that. I think that changed the way I think about 19th century history. Changed the way I think about Abraham Lincoln, because I think this is the world he's coming out of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I wandered so far from that.
No, that was really interesting. Anne Grant, you had a question?
Yeah, I was curious. You said she had all this, quote, stuff that she brought to the West, and yet her family had lost all its money and her father was in prison. How did she have all this stuff?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I don't know for sure, but I've got a couple of thoughts about it. One is her grandmother. So her it's her step grandmother, married her grandfather, when she's very young. So it's really her grandmother in Middletown. Her grandfather dies, but her grandmother had a lot of money, and her grandmother had money before marriage. That was both their second marriages. And when she's widowed, she's got a lot of money. So I know that Juliette lives with that grandmother in Boston for extended periods of time before she gets married. So that's one of my guesses. And I know that she lives in the Crescent. So she lives just off the Boston Common in a really beautiful house, in a set of townhouses. So it's possible that the grandmother set her up. So that's one. And the second thing is, I think her uncle back in Chicago, who's been socking away money and making money, not only in his income from the US government, but he's making money in trade. I think her uncle may also have fronted some of this. The third alternative is that the Kinsey family, so that John Kinsey also had money and that they bought this together, that this was not a trousseau. This was, they bought these things as they began their life together. But I know they make this trip to New York. No, oh my gosh, that's such a good, that's exactly the kind of question that was on, like, how did she do this? Where did this money come from? Not her parents. Eventually her parents come and live in Chicago. And they'll find jobs for her dad, but her dad is just completely ruined by the 1819, 1820. And it's highly political. The Second Bank of New York, or the Second Bank of the US blows up, and this is, they're part of that. Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah. Sorry again, but no, great question. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I know that we're at 8 o'clock. I know Alex has a couple things that she wants to announce. We can stay and answer some more questions if there are questions, but I want to make sure, Alex, you get your announcements in before we lose anybody.
Thank you. Anne, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And for those of you who would like to learn more about Juliette Kinzie and her world, I will have you just be aware that the book is available at the Lake Forest bookstore. So please go check it out. Also, we have a couple more book talks upcoming in April. On the 8th, journalist Deb Douglas is going to be talking about the US Civil Rights Trail. And in keeping with this sort of Age of Lincoln theme, on the 22nd, John Wasik will be talking about his book Lincolnomics, so talking about Abraham Lincoln in conjunction with his work in developing American infrastructure. So those are both available on our website to register for. They are free programs, and we love being able to offer these for free, but as always, to continue to offer them for free, we appreciate it if you consider making a small donation to allow us to continue to bring these wonderful talks to you. So you can also do that through our website. But thank you guys so much for coming, and Anne, thank you again for sharing your fascinating work with us.
Thanks. Thank you.
Are there any more questions before we end? All right. So Anne, this was brilliant. So highly entertaining. I loved it. And I think that it's a really interesting story, and it definitely makes me want to sit down and read more about her. And it does shift the way you see the sort of regional history and who told it and what stories we actually know. I mean, it's really well done. So thank you so much.
Thanks. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun. Take care.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.